Hello, and welcome to episode 103 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
My man, how you doing up there?
I'm outstanding. It is mid-70s, a little breezy, but it's a beautiful day in the valley.
It's good. It's always nice when you can measure the quality of your life by the weather.
I do frequently because if it's raining or overcast, my quality of life goes down. That's why I could never live in like Portland or Seattle.
Yeah, I'm amused by that because it implies you go outside.
Oh, I go outside.
Do you? Just
Yeah,
around the
walk
backyard?
over to my office and stay inside the rest of the day.
Fair enough. From the house to the office to the house.
That's the way it has to be.
Yeah, I feel you. I've opened all the curtains. That's as close to outside as I'm getting today, I think.
Congratulations on that. First time the sun's seen you in weeks, I'm sure.
Well, there's been a pretty good reason we've been stuck inside, at least for the last week or so, which is there was a big LSAT.
Or a small LSAT, really, if you think about it.
I suppose
Although
so.
big for everybody who took it. But as we'll
Yeah.
talk about, this was one of the smallest LSATs on record, certainly the smallest in a while. And that had some effects on us over the weekend. But first, John, before we talk about the size of the LSAT, let's talk about the drink that you might be having tonight.
Well, this is in preparation to go outside, interestingly enough. I've got a good mutual friend of ours actually passing through town tonight, and he's going to be staying with me until Saturday, if we both live that long. So I'm drinking a vodka and one of those Monster Energy drinks that you recommended a couple episodes ago, I think.
Yeah, the Zero Ultra.
Yeah. We had speculated as to whether it would make a good mixer. I can confirm it does.
I knew that it would. I'm glad that I've turned you on to the Monster Energy Zero Ultra. And
Yeah.
I think I'm going to call them tomorrow and see if we can get sponsorship.
There you go.
Because-
Our first and only endorsement, Monster Energy.
Send me a case every month and I will be completely satisfied. I drink one every day.
You can add it to the list of things you've turned me on to. But yeah, I know he's going to drag me out on the town tonight, so I'm trying to pep myself up for it.
I'm envious. I know you guys will have a lot of fun. Certainly when I've been hanging out with both of you, we've all had a great time. And that goes from Los Angeles to New York to Napa, I think.
Yeah, you name it.
Charleston, of course.
Charleston for sure. Yeah. What about you? What are you having?
I am having a vodka soda. So something pretty straightforward. I saw you were having vodka, so I just have some Tito's, which is, ever present in my household. And for some reason, recently I've had a taste for soda. It just, I don't know, it seems like effervescent and a little bit upbeat. I'm feeling good, so that's my drink for the night.
I dig it, man. Yeah, speaking of endorsements, Mr. Tito Beverage, if you are listening to this, we could really use a sponsorship, sir. We're both going broke on your product.
I was an early advocate for Tito's vodka, as you know, back when he didn't have national distribution. So
Yeah. People are always amused by the fact that his last name actually is Beverage.
yes, not spelled exactly like beverage. It's got a
little
D
different.
in there.
That's a little
But certainly that's kind of a great name to have for somebody who makes batched vodka down in Texas.
Yeah, I think I told you the story of bumping into him before he was anybody in a bar in Austin years ago and having drinks, and he was telling me about this like distillation process that he was using with multiple stills and stuff. And of course I didn't understand it. We were in a bar. I thought he was weird. And I later learned this is the guy. God, I should have been friendlier.
Should have made better friends with him. You might have had that lifetime supply.
Probably so. But it's never too late, Tito. So if you
We'll
want an
send him
apology
this
in person.
episode. John, what's the music choice of tonight?
Yeah, you can put this one on me too, because I chose the song. What I think this prefaces, as people will see soon enough, is that this was a test where it was very, very difficult, as we've made known, to get information. There weren't a lot of people. It was only 2 days as opposed to 3. We've just struggled, frankly, and I don't mind admitting it, to get as much clarity as we typically are able to get. So I picked a song from a band you don't like. It's a Genesis song called Land of Confusion.
Yes.
I think it's a great tune. We may agree to disagree on this.
If you want to go to sleep, it's a great tune. But
Buddy,
beyond that,
you have
I don't
no
find it
idea how
useful.
much I want to go to sleep.
You're going out tonight.
I know.
Yeah, Land of Confusion. This goes way back. That's like a early 1980s song. I'm just not a big fan of it. I'm not a big fan of Genesis. They're too, I don't know, instrumentalized. They're very happy with their own skills. But a lot of people know that Phil Collins was the drummer and lead singer. And if you watch Emily in Paris, that's his daughter, Lily. That's actually the lead in that series. I haven't watched it, but my wife has, so I've heard all about it.
There you go. Big fan of hers as well. Best eyebrows in the business.
I wouldn't know yet.
Oh, Eugene Levy actually probably takes the title, but she's up there. But
yeah, those are pretty thick.
That's right. Anyway, I love Genesis, but again, I think that song is pretty emblematic, as again, listeners will hear soon enough, of exactly how the last 5 or so days have played out.
Let's move on. Let's go through the LSAT world relatively quickly, and then we'll get into this test and break it down as best we possibly can. What's been going on in the LSAT world?
Well, the most immediate thing I think coming up, aside from the test that we just had, is that next Wednesday, February 23rd, will be the classic February makeup test. So every LSAT these days has got a built-in makeup day for anyone who has technical issues, proctor problems, etc. That's going to be next Wednesday. So I know some people listening to this are preparing for that. Some people listening to this may not have known it existed, but it does. We'll talk about score release in a bit, but you'll be lumped in if you're taking the makeup to the regular score release. So good news there.
Yeah, even though you take the makeup a week and a half after the regular administration, it doesn't affect your scores, which, by the way, is your friendly notification that they can process scores even faster if they need to. They just choose not to.
Yeah, another friendly notification for those of you who actually are taking it or are curious. It will not be one of the tests we're about to talk about. You'll get a new exam. It won't be something you saw before, something that we're going to touch on. So there you go.
Yeah, and then you got the Spanish LSAT coming up on March 3rd.
Yeah, something we haven't given a whole lot of coverage to historically, but there is a Spanish test on the 3rd of March.
Which, if I recall correctly, there are some Puerto Rican law schools that use that exam. Unfortunately, the results of that test are not available or usable for applying to ABA law schools in the mainland U.S. and Canada, but it's kind of an interesting event. I've yet to really put my hands on a Spanish LSAT yet and really look at it and see what they did with it, whether they created new questions or whether they did a direct conversion of the regular questions, which is more along the lines of what I suspect, but maybe someday.
Yeah, given what they've done with the LSAT India over the years, I imagine it's probably just a Google Translate situation.
A conversion of sorts,
right?
Removing certain cultural elements and so forth, adding others, I would imagine. And then we got the March LSAT.
Yeah.
That is coming up. Now, the registration deadline for that has already passed. That was February 3rd. But that test is coming up on Friday, March 11th. It's another Friday, Saturday test. I presume I'll be around, although my birthday's in that range, so I'm not really interested in dealing with the LSAT around my birthday, but whatever. And you should be able to sign up for your time for that February LSAT about 14 to 16 days ahead of Friday, March 11th. And then the score release on that exam will be at the end of March, on Wednesday, March 30th. And after that, you get a couple more LSATs. You get the April LSAT, which is coming up on April 29th and 30th. There is still time to register for that test. The registration is March 16th. Scores are released in May. Somebody asked me the other day if you could use the April LSAT to apply to any law schools, and I directed them to a blog post that we have about the top 100 law schools and their deadlines. Yes, there are multiple schools in the top 100 that will accept April. The LSAT after that is the June LSAT. Registration for that is at the end of April, so you see how all of this starts cascading into each other. That test is Friday and Saturday, June 10th and 11th, and the score release on that is the end of June, on Thursday, the 30th. And there are 3 schools in the top 25 that will accept the results of the June LSAT. Now, obviously, that's getting late in the cycle. And for me, those tests are less about first-time applicants, although some people will use it that way and, skate into law school at the very end of the cycle. But those April and June tests are really useful for a couple of things in my mind. Number one, if you're on the wait list, you use the results of those tests to help you leverage yourself off the wait list. Number two, scholarship reconsideration. An improved LSAT score gives you the opportunity to go back to the school and say, hey, I've added a few more points, give me more money. And we've seen that happen all the way through June before, and it'll happen again this year. So you still have options in your toolkit to kind of like change your situation if you need that kind of assistance. So something to think about.
Yeah, I like that. That April test is interesting to me for another reason as well. They pushed it so far deep into April that it's the first one we'll see this year where you can actually take the prior test and then still register for the next one. You won't have your scores yet from March, but if you took the March test that week into the 11th and 12th, you'd still have 4 to 5 days to sign up for April, potentially. That
Make
was
people
not
feel
the
well.
case for February. Yeah. So if you're signed up for March and you're not sure about April, take March and you'll still have time to make that decision.
Yeah, you don't have to commit to April now,
Hmm.
is what you're saying. So if you took March and you're like, I don't feel great about that test, you have that option as well, which is useful. Although, again, you're getting a little bit late in the cycle, but this cycle is starting to show some signs of, I guess, improvement as far as applicants and competition. Applicants, I think when I checked this morning, were down 9.2% compared to last year. And last year there was a rise in applicants, so it's still not down where it covers that. But this is a situation where you're starting to see a little bit less competition than we had earlier in the cycle. About a month ago, I think it was down about 6%. Now we're down about 9%. So we're losing people compared to what was going on last year. And that gives you, the applicant, a better position because there's fewer people competing for the same number of spots.
Yeah, we're seeing almost a weekly decline at this point. I think you and I talked a day or two ago. They all blur together. But it was in the mid 8 point something percent decrease, and now today it was 9.2. So just within a couple of days, it dropped about a half a percentage point.
Yep. And a week and a half ago it was in the sevens.
Hmm.
And 2 to 3 weeks ago it was in the upper sixes. So it's been moving down. End of December was like 5%, somewhere
Yeah.
in there. So it's been actually going downward and we've been losing applicants there. So if you're in a position where you're still applying or you're looking to change your situation, one thing that will help is that we have some free seminars coming up. And you can always sign up for those. They are at powerscore.com/free seminars. We've got one on February 23rd. That is about logic games and templating, something that I very strongly recommend that you study and make sure that you're very on top of. So that could be helpful. And then we've got one on March 8th about parallel reasoning. One of my favorite ones to talk about because to me, it's so easy to deconstruct those questions once you understand what they are doing with the topics. And I think there might be another webinar that we've added, Jon, but you'll have to refresh my memory.
Oh, it'll be me. How cagey of you. Well, sort of by request, but also by design. You and I were intending to do this anyway. There is going to be a crystal ball session that we do, one of these classic events that we put on. We're going to do it for the March and the April tests collectively for now. We may split it up and do another one, but for now we're doing a joint March-April crystal ball. We're going to host that on the evening of March 2nd, which I think is a Wednesday, at 8 p.m. Eastern. Dave and I will be there. Another one of our favorite instructors named Adam Tyson will be there as well, helping us out with things. So it'll be a full house of us and hopefully you. That'll be a lot of fun.
That'll be at 8 p.m. on March 2nd. And as we have been doing recently, that will be free to the public. So you could attend. There is no cost. See what we're talking about in terms of what kind of content you'll see on the LSAT, as well as test predictions for what they might reuse from old unreleased tests, if any. And then thereafter, that will not be available to the public. So it is one night only in Cleveland. And so make sure you attend if you want to get that information for the March and then subsequent April tests. If you're a PowerScore student, it will then go into your online student centers for your courses, analytics, what have you. And so you'll be able to access it thereafter, as well as the problem sets that we recommend. We'll assemble those for that particular test set. Those aren't ready yet because we haven't actually put together the content. We're still assessing what happened here with the February LSAT, but those will be coming once we go ahead and make that happen on March 2nd. So if you get a chance, come join us.
Yeah, I can tell you, in fact, as a real moment-to-moment update, I started putting together problem sets for this new one last Friday as I started hearing people reporting back on what they were seeing from this test and then comparing it to January. So it's in progress, and I've got some really, I think, interesting things to show to people.
Yeah, we have these databases and spreadsheets that are all color blocked with where tests came from, the threads through the years of exams that have been used, what's available to them, how recently they've used certain exams. And that's kind of how we slowly piece it together to make these predictions. It is, to some extent, a process of elimination. We know all the available options, and each time we're like, okay, they use that, so that's not available. It doesn't mean it's impossible to have it available. It just means it's less likely to be available. And as we've seen, we're more often than right than not. So we'll continue on with that. And we only do those when we feel like we have something to say that reflects those tests. We didn't do one for February because we felt that what we learned from January really didn't change what we'd said in the January/February Crystal Ball. Now we feel like we can update that to some extent, so that's why we're doing it.
Which is a perfect transition into what we have just learned. Let's talk about this February test.
Exactly.
So, February LSAT, I suppose the first thing to mention, just some housekeeping. The score release for this test will be the morning of March 3rd. That's a Thursday. Scores will begin to come out more or less right at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, as I mentioned before, anyone taking the makeup next week, they will get their scores on the 3rd of March. And as long as you have a writing sample submitted and approved and nothing about your test got flagged, you can count on a score at that point. You'll get an email and your online lsac.org account will update.
Yeah, and then that is in plenty of time for the April registration if you need it. So you'll have about 13 days to the 16th, so you're good. But let's talk about what we just had over the last couple of days.
Sure.
You had 3 test dates. You had 2 primary test dates, which were Friday and Saturday. So that's not too many. And that played a role in some of the issues that we ran into with this exam. A lot of times what you've been seeing is 3-day test administrations. So something like Saturday, Sunday, Monday, or Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, or even Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Not this exam. This was only Friday and only Saturday for the main administration.
Right.
Then on Tuesday, the 14th, what you ended up with was the kind of like the accommodated pencil and paper test takers. So they had that, although I think that was actually the 15th, not the 14th. I was like, wait, Valentine's Day? They didn't do that, come to think of it. So it was the day after Valentine's Day, which was certainly no picnic for those people who wanted to do something on Valentine's Day. Now, one of the things about this, the way this test worked was those 2 days were very small administrations. You know, in these larger administrations, you'll see anywhere from like 6,000 all the way up to, say, 8,500 people take a test in a given day. This is one of the reasons they cycle through a lot of different sections. There's a lot of people talking about it. Each of these tests on Friday and Saturday were only a little bit over 4,000 people. That's a really small number. And so you not only had a small test group each day, you only had 2 test days. You add in the paper and pencil test takers, which are usually just a couple hundred at most. And you had probably somewhere over or in the middle of about 8,000 test takers. That's not a whole lot of people who are actually coming out with test information or talking about the test. And so one of the things that Jon and I said early on is, you know, we kept getting asked about the podcast, which is totally normal. We're like, we'll do it if we feel okay about it. And part of the process here is that it takes inputs to get the output of what we say about what's real, what's experimental, what our scale predictions are. And frankly, going into this test, we had our worries about the way it would work, and whether or not we'd get enough information. There was a certain point where we started to feel like, especially early on Friday, I'm like, not hearing anything. And the way this process goes for us is this, is we may have all these databases and all this information about historical usage and what were on these prior tests, but it has to be connected to what's happening currently. Somebody's talking about their sectional topics, we can see that and say, oh, let's connect it to what we know to be the case. Or somebody sends us an email, or a student is talking to an instructor, what have you. They share certain pieces of information. We collate all of that, and we're like, that's what's going on here. That's this. And then we can lock into the sections that we already know from years past or extant and use that information to kind of like begin putting things together. And then it's a process of accumulation. When you have this few number of people taking a test like this, you don't get a huge amount of accumulation of information. And so for us, it became a situation where on Friday night, we're like, we'll see. On Saturday, we started to feel a little bit better about it. And that continued through Sunday and Monday as people continued to add information. And we got a little bit more information yesterday. So we feel good about what we're saying, but it is not going to be quite as solid as it has been in the past. And we'll talk about that when we get into it.
Yeah, I think people are going to hear some caveats throughout this discussion.
Yeah, if you're not getting the information from the student body at large, it lessens the degree of confidence that we have in some of the things that we're saying. And as I've said many times, we don't just randomly predict this. We don't make it up. We don't pull numbers out of a hat. It's built upon data justification. And often we feel very strongly about the data that we've received. Here, I feel strongly about some things, less so about others. So we'll talk about that when the moment comes.
Yeah,
Anyway, let's continue on to how
I
it
think that's
went
a fair
overall.
asterisk. The first thing we should probably touch on is just how did the actual proctoring, the test itself, how did it go logistically? And I've got good news here, just as we had in January. There were very few issues, at least widespread issues. And again, that's little consolation for the individuals who suffered through problems. But on the whole, we didn't see the sorts of things that occasionally, the bumps in the road that were frankly cataclysmic for everyone that we had seen, say, last October or last summer. This is 2 tests in a row now in 2022 where I have to tip my hat a little bit to the way that the test has actually been administered. They seem to be running pretty smoothly at the moment. Could be because there are only 8,500 people.
Yeah, when you have
But
a small test administration, the pressure's way down. Maybe the proctors don't feel as harried as they might otherwise. Although, as usual, we always hear of stories of weirdness, especially on the proctor side of, I need you to move your mouse, or can you adjust your camera, or can you
right,
move your desk? And again, that's really not LSAC's problem in the sense of they're not causing it. It's a Proctor U issue. That's about training your proctors to realize, hey, if you're going to engage a student during the test, pause the test.
right.
I was talking to one student and they were like, I was watching it count down. I could see my timer losing time and they weren't doing anything. And it's that's the most, I think, frustrating and maddening experience, among several that you can have during this. You're losing time. It's valuable. It's the number one commodity on this test, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Hmm. Yeah, we've given advice on this exact point before. To quickly reiterate, have a conversation with your proctor before you begin the test. It's not foolproof, but it does seem to help. It's insurance in a way. Tell them, if you need to have a conversation with me, if you need anything done on my end, pause the clock and then talk to me.
That's right. But overall, a pretty good test.
I think so.
Nothing systemic. No pop-up windows. Nobody getting, not thousands or hundreds of people getting kicked out of the test at once or not able to get in.
Right.
But for those of you who had issues, we know let's be honest, it sucks.
It sucks.
So let's move on and let's get into kind of what we really want to talk about, which is the main show of the domestic February LSAT. As usual, I'll run through the disclaimer list.
You gonna do it?
Yeah, I think
Yeah, you do it.
You
probably do it by memory from now on.
It's getting there, and then I'll let you do the opening discussion of logic games. How's that for a good deal? First off, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the various sections. We're going to talk about the content in those sections. We're going to identify the game topics, for example, or some of the reading comprehension topics or LR topics. This is public information. LSAC is mostly concerned about the identification of the experimental section during the test administration. So what they've been saying, what they specifically said last January was, hey, can you wait to talk about it? They said that to test takers. They said that to us. And now that all the main administrations are done, we're free to talk about it. But it is public knowledge. A lot of the stuff that you can see, not all of it, but most all of it is out there. It might be on some chat board. It might be something that someone was saying in a Discord. Who knows? Second thing is this. I see a lot of people talking about, I had that same section order, or I hated that first LG. And someone else is like, no, I hated the second LG. Section order does not mean anything. You could have your sections be exactly the same in terms of content and be in different positions. Meaning that person who hated the first logic games they had in section 1, maybe that was your section 4 that you had, and you're talking about the same section. At one point, I think I posted on Reddit, I was like, friendly reminder, there's different section orders, and it might be the same test that you're talking about. Usually they change all day long. This was a smaller administration, so there were far fewer changes, which you'd think would be a good thing, but not always. Secondly, or thirdly at this point, disclosing information. The test makers allow you to talk about generalities and topic. They do not allow you to talk about specifics of the question, like what the question type was, what the solution was, what the correct answer choice was, what the wording of the rules were. So we're not going to break that prohibition. They don't want us to talk about that stuff. They don't want you to talk about it, and we think that's fair. So you can talk about the generalities of the test, but they would like you to wait until the main testing days are over. Don't get into specifics. Next disclaimer, the fourth on our super list is, look, taking the real LSAT is a terrible experience in certain ways. It's grueling, it's mentally draining, it's anxiety inducing. We all understand that, we acknowledge that. What that means, though, is that it is often a far worse experience than a prep test or practice test that you might take. And so a lot of times people are like, oh, it was the worst test I've ever taken. Probably wasn't the worst test that you've ever taken, but it was worse than any prep test that you've taken. And so keep that in mind, is that there's this relativity aspect to the real thing that changes the dimension. It's kind of like practicing a piano piece. Sitting in your house practicing that piece, it's like, well, there's not really any pressure. And then going to do the actual performance in front of 5,000 people, now all of a sudden the pressure's on. It's going to feel completely different. That's normal. But it means that there's a negativity bias that creeps into your recollections. Next thing is this. We think every LSAT's difficult. They all have their challenging points. We may talk about sections here as being harder or easier. That's on a relative scale. It means that they're all hard. It's just really super hard or not quite as hard as usual. But they're all difficult. So if we say something to the effect in a casual comment like this was the easier of the two sections, we're not saying that it was simple and easy and that you should have crushed it. We're saying that it was less difficult than the other sections or historically the baseline for those sections. Next, one of my favorites. When you go through the recall of this, you will discover, especially if you look at it globally, that the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections of the same type. You had a dancer's game. Was it the only dancer's game? No, it certainly wasn't. And we could go back historically and look at a ton of different topics, whether it was speeding or writers in Nigeria or music, and realize, oh, they put the same topics in different sections so that when people went out to talk, they wouldn't know what they were saying. Somebody's like, I didn't like that dancer's game. Well, you might not have had the same dancer's game as somebody else. So just be careful in terms of your recall. This has been happening for a while, and it's a known tactic that they use. Next, our estimations of what is real and experimental are based upon certain assumptions about reusage. Namely, that if a section has been used in the past as a scored section, that they did not now use it as an experimental. So be aware of that as an assumption that's going on here. We'll talk a little bit more about this point as it kind of comes up in the discussion Jon's about to initiate. The next one, very important for tonight. You might not hear your section discussed. This is just the luck of the draw. If we didn't get enough information on it, we're not going to speculate it and talk about scoring scales or difficulty because we just didn't get enough information or, in some cases, any information about the section. So if that happens, that's okay. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your test experience or you. It just means that we didn't have sufficient information. We hope that we have all the sections. We don't think for sure that in this case that we do. We think we have most of them for most of the test takers. We'll come back to it, though. Second to last one here is this. We're going to ask us very specifically in this case, please do not summarize this online. If somebody wants to know what it is that we said, please direct them to the podcast to listen to it. This is going to be very nuanced at times, and there's going to be a lot of disclaimers built into what we're doing. I don't want someone to go out there and be like, well, this is what they said, and it's for sure -1 or 0, when we really backed off some of those predictions in this particular instance. So we want people to hear what we said directly. It's just a friendly request. There's a world in which we don't do this podcast if people are misrepresenting what we say, or really not even misrepresenting it, accidentally not conveying the full scope of what we want. We want to be heard for saying what we're saying. So just keep that in mind. And then the last of this horrendously long and evil disclaimer list that I'm beginning to loathe completely is, this was by far the hardest test that we've encountered yet in terms of data collection and tracking. So give us some latitude on this. And also, if you feel like, hey, there was information that you had that we were missing, feel free to share it with us. The test is over. It's not going to affect anything. It's not affecting the retakers. They'll get a different test. We're happy to continue compiling information because that will help future test takers down the road. So I'm not saying give us a break because that's really not what this is, but it's more just like be aware this was a really high bar of challenge at times with this. So we've done the best that we possibly can. Jon, thank God that's done.
Yeah.
That was the worst.
I don't know how much vodka's in that vodka soda, but pour some more.
I need to drink
and a round of
it.
applause to you, man, for that tedious monologue.
It's terrible.
I know that's probably the least fun moment of this. But I do appreciate a couple alley-oops, and I will also say this: Dave may not ask for a break, but I may begin by pleading for one. Um, because this was hard to double down on his last point and to allude to something that you mentioned earlier, Dave. When the test makers actually introduce less variety in terms of how they mix and match sections, it actually can make our lives a lot more difficult because we need some of that variety to spot the similarities and differences. Where the overlap doesn't exist is often where we can begin to make determinations. So when there's nothing but consistency, we sometimes have a hard time separating fact from fiction, or in this case, real from experimental.
Yeah,
And go.
it's a zebra. You need comparing and contrasting to realize the zebra's moving. And sometimes we didn't get that. And so there were some challenges. And they did some things here that I think were very savvy. You're about to talk about one of them. So I'll just cede the floor to you.
No, it's perfect. And that won't be the last time you hear Dave say zebra tonight. So
That's right. It's on my mind.
that was it. Yeah. Yeah, the camouflage of this test, speaking of stripe patterns, was, I think, particularly well done, if I'm going to give credit where I wouldn't like to. So here's what we saw right out of the gates on Friday morning. We woke up and we started looking, first of all, to see if they were reusing a test that we could immediately identify. And in part, they were. We saw, for instance, some reading comprehension topics that we could pinpoint to a past test, which I'll let Dave clarify in just a second. But we also saw that nearly everyone on Friday, and certainly through the morning, had the same composition of sections: a single logical reasoning, a single reading comprehension, and 2 sets of logic games, which means almost everyone through at least the early part of Friday was seeing experimental games. And that's fine. There's nothing weird about that. So we just started tracking it. And we saw these 2 sets of games. Before I break down what we think was real and experimental, let me just give you the 2 sections. And then I'll explain where our suspicions lie. So there was one set of logic games, 23 questions, that had these 4 games in it. It was Days of the Week, which is what most people called it, very unhelpfully, I should note. I think it was about dance rehearsals. That was the majority opinion, was that it was dance rehearsals, but I believe that was the first game of the section. The other 3 were more clear. There was a game about sequencing of instruments, orchestra pieces, and compositions. It was a conductor, I believe, sequencing the pieces. There was a game about stocking tools onto shelves, 3 shelves with tools being laid out there. And then a game that got a lot of attention, and most people listening to this will recognize, fashion brands in different retail clothing stores. So those 4 games made up a section that we saw over and over on Friday, starting in the morning and really throughout the day. We also saw, though, paired with it, another set of logic games, also 23 questions that had these 4 topics. There was a game about presentations or speeches on a teacher's research. I think a lot of people call this a retirement party. There was a game in that section about oil paintings, what sounded to be almost like still lifes of fruit. Bananas, figs, kiwis, I think limes was one of the paintings. There was a game in that section about morning and evening hikes with hiking tours and hiking guides. And then again, a game that a lot of people may recognize about biologists assigned to research stations and the reassignments as they were swapped back and forth between, I think, 3 different research stations.
Stations 1, 2, 3.
That's right. So those were the 2 sets of games, 4 and 4, that we were seeing on Friday. And of course, at that point, we couldn't pinpoint them to a test. I will say that one section about presentations and oil paintings, the hikes and the biologists and research stations, that came from October 2021, the experimental games that we had seen there. So we knew that they had come from a past use experimentally, but that wasn't enough at that point for us to confirm what counted and what didn't. And so with bated breath, we waited through the weekend to see if at any point they would use just one of those 2 sets by itself, because then we would know what was scored and it would confirm things. And I can say, and I'll speak for Dave on this, it was a very disappointing weekend in that regard. Through the entire weekend, they never split those 2 sets of games up that we saw. And again, I think Dave can echo the affirmation of that. Did you ever see one or the other by itself through the weekend?
Not on Friday, Saturday, no.
I didn't either.
Yeah, one of the things you said to me was like, well, we'll see what happens on Sunday. This was late on Saturday, and I was like, no, we won't. We're watching the Super Bowl, and there's no LSAT tomorrow. And you were like, oh, I didn't realize what day it was.
I had very
And
mixed emotions with that, of course, because I was really happy for the day off, but I was also very much looking forward to some clarification that wasn't going to come, at least
yeah.
that day.
And by the way, you made a comment about the days of the week, the dance rehearsals, one of the
Mhm.
dance games that was out there.
Mm.
The reason days of the week doesn't really do a whole lot for us is because so many games have that. It'd be like saying this game featured 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that describes a ton of games.
Yeah.
We're more interested from an identification standpoint of the features of the game. What type of dances might have been involved or what was going on. And so that's what actually helps us figure out the game sourcing of it. When we're actually looking at the game itself and trying to figure out the mechanics of it, that's when days of the week is super helpful, or either the number of players or the variables or so forth.
Yeah.
So that's why Jon kind of like dismissed the days of the week there.
Yeah, that was my kind of like shrug off. It's similar to someone who was trying his best, I think, to contribute. And it said, well, I know it had the variables S, T, and V. I was like, well,
Those are pretty common.
yeah. And this wasn't in conversation to me. This was just posted, but I remember reading it and being like, ugh,
You're trying.
that's not horribly helpful,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I appreciate it. Sometimes those little details do kind of like piece together. And I think people would be surprised to find out how avidly we are studying information everywhere and sometimes ignoring information, because we can see when information really isn't accurate, or more frequently the case when people are having recall issues with their memory. Now, I had somebody say to me, yeah, I had this reading comp topic, and I was like, the other 3 are fine, but this one doesn't fit in. And they're like, oh, wait, that was a practice test that I took last week. And it's an honest mistake. I understood it. I was like, woo, made me feel a lot better to hear that it was a practice test, because for a moment I was like, is this another section? I didn't know about this section, but it didn't make sense. So
Yeah. Or when people have clearly fallen victim to like this obfuscation that LSAC is trying to impart here. When someone is like, I didn't have that section, or I had that. And it's very clear that they've confused topics based on something that they've misunderstood. That like imitation game. I don't know, I've got the Turing movie on my mind, but you can watch people sometimes get fooled by this, sometimes by section order alone, sometimes by like generic topic. And it's everything I can do not to weigh in and try to clarify, but I know I'm not supposed to, so I don't.
maybe in the great future, I'll make a Twitch stream of us doing this. Be like, watch us stream how we do it in live, and the comments that we make where we're like, that person's got this confused, or nope, that's probably the same game you're talking about.
Yeah, you could watch us drink and go gray in real time. Thrilling, I'm sure.
So continue on with the LG story.
Right. So that was Friday, and we just saw this like coupling of these two sets all day, and so we waited. And then on Saturday, what we saw was single games, finally. And we're like, here we go. But of course, the single game that we saw on Friday, that set, were 4 new games. We knew at that point they were real, which was great, but they had no overlap with the 2 that we had seen from Friday. So some mystery remains, but here were the 4 games on Saturday that we know are real. So if you had any of these, they counted. These 4, 23 questions. The first game, or one of the games, was about interviewing historical subjects. I think it was an author interviewing historical subjects in the morning and the afternoon. Another days of the week game, by the way. There was a game, another dancers game, and this time about assigning dancers to the type of dance that they were doing. Things like polka, rumba, swing, and tap. There was a game in there about morning and evening, days of the week, volunteer shifts. And I think this was people working singles and doubles. I heard the place where they volunteered described a couple of different ways, but the consensus seemed to be a diner. Booths, I think, is where the confusion lied.
Booths, yeah.
Booths. And then finally, a game about a building being renovated, the different wings of the building, north, south, and west, and there were departments in the different wings that were getting renovations. That section of games counted. We know that because it existed independently on its own, and we saw that on Saturday, but of course that's a third set and didn't do much to clarify Friday for us.
So what's your speculation on those 2 logic games from Friday?
So, part of the reason that if you were following some of the commentary that Dave and I were posting online, really trying to maybe soften the blow if we weren't able to do this particular episode, was we knew that we could not distinguish between those 2 sets of games on Friday without one of them existing on its own. There was just no way to tell them apart, real experimental. And then we caught a break. We caught a break yesterday with the accommodated test, because the accommodated test, and again, I'm smiling, I'm grinning ear to ear saying this, the accommodated test only had one of those 2 from Friday. The section of games on Friday that appeared by itself as real on the accommodated test, so presumably real forever, was the section with the fashion brands and the shelves with the tools. I know there's a lot of people either just crying out triumphantly in joy or pounding their fists.
Yeah, shelves and was a hard game by all reports.
So was fashion brands,
and so was fashion brands. Which, by the way, I'll make a point. In October 2020, there was a game about fashion brands. So at first we were like, is there overlap here? No, this is a different game. But it's not, when you look at that section, so that kind of like days of the week dance rehearsals, the instruments, orchestra, the stocking of the shelves, and the fashion brands, that's the real section. We're pretty certain about this. We know it was real for the accommodated test takers. It'd be really weird for it to be experimental on Friday. What that means then is that the reassignment section, the research stations, the hikers, the oil paintings of like the fruits, that would be your experimental of those two. Is it possible that that's not the case? Yeah, it is possible. I'll put that disclaimer right out there. We don't think it is the case. We do think, in fact, that shelves and fashion brands are real, and I think we've explained why that's the case. So just take that with a grain of salt, though. Right. This is not an exact science when they pull this, and I think they did this intentionally.
Yeah, if we hadn't been watching yesterday, we really would have been stuck, frankly.
Yeah, in fact, we might have tended to think that the reassignments game was real for various factors. But
because we had seen that set come up as an experimental before, it makes sense that they'd now reuse it as real.
Yeah, and for those of you who are like, well, if it was an experimental, that means it's real. No, that is not the case. We've seen this throughout history, that there are multiple instances where they'll try a game, not like the results on it, reconfigure it and try it again, and then when they use it the next time, then it turns out to be real. So that could be what's going on with this section here, is maybe they didn't like the results of it, so they come back and they make a few tweaks to it. Now it's a little bit different. Maybe that gives them the results. I watched a game, a number of years back, go through a real evolution from like its original form to the second experimental to the real release of that. So that is something that we know that they do. That's just, one of those benefits of us having done this for a long time and having the view of history. It's like, that's not off the table for them. So that didn't, just because it was an experimental before, didn't automatically tell us it was real. It gave us a lot of information about it, but it didn't prove it was real. It was the paper and pencil situation that told us that that was for sure being scored for those people. And that makes it exceedingly likely that that was the case on Friday for all of those who had that shelving fashion brand game set.
Yeah. You don't even need some like elephant level memory to point to instances where they have reused an experimental as experimental more than once. As I'll let Dave elaborate here on in Reading Comp, it actually was the case for one of the sections of Reading Comp, this test. They had used one multiple times as experimental, and then previously as real, and now again as real. Yeah, so with that, teeing it up for you, take it away.
Let's go ahead and hit this, because when you have a bunch of people on Friday who are taking, logic games, and they've got two of them, that means everything else that they were seeing was real. And so from a reading comprehension standpoint and a logical reasoning standpoint, we were able to say very early on, hey, these sections we know are being scored here. So let's talk a little bit about what we saw with some of the reading comprehension. And really, I'm going to focus on what we know to have been real, because we saw this on both Friday and Saturday. So what we had here was a reuse. This was a section that was used back in October 2020 as a scored section, and they'd drawn from earlier experimentals in February 2018 and September 2019. And so this is a section, as Jon is saying, that has a long history to it. And it's a hard section overall, but it is not atypically hard compared to recent reading comprehension. So let's go through the 4 passage topics here. The first is a passage about Thomas Pringle and the pruning of Mary Prince. So kind of compiling and editing and pruning this narrative and really kind of somewhat damaging it as he was going through it. Works in the ideas of Creole language, slavery narratives, and a lot of people said this was a deceptively hard passage. That was the first passage in this section. Then you had a second passage. It was about alternate views on how lawyers should do their jobs. One was kind of more relational. The other was a little bit more traditional. and kind of like critics' opinions coming in. The third was a tough passage that was comparative about the science of kind of like Darwin and evolution and gene plasticity. This was an experimental that came directly from February 2018. And then the fourth passage was about economists and not taking into account the views on history and anthropology when formulating theories about bartering and credit systems. A little bit of Adam Smith thrown in there, kind of like the classic, economics passage that you run into. So that section was real. We know that for a fact. A lot of people had it as their only reading comprehension. Another reading comprehension that we saw that was real as well. I'll give a little bit less description of this. This is one that really we hadn't seen as a full construction yet. There's been, pieces of parts of this through the years, but not in this exact construction. So whereas the first section, we were like, we've got a ton of information on this. The second one, we had less information, but we know it's real as well. And this was a passage that included jazz, another one about contract law, class action lawsuits, and arbitration and so forth. One about socialism and communism and technocrats. And then one about zebra mussels. So like the water shellfish, not like mussels on a zebra.
Right.
The strength of them. So that's the zebra reference, not the exact to the one that I made before. We saw that first on Saturday, but that was a real section as well. And really, for Jon and I, these were the only two sections that we encountered throughout the entire week of tests. So we know the way that came up that both of them were real. It did not seem like there were very many or any double reading comprehension test takers. I saw one or two people make mention of like, did anybody have that? But they never went any further with it. We didn't have any reports from any students. Nobody sent us any messages. We got nothing from, our various informational channels about this. So is it possible someone out there had a double reading comprehension and had an experimental? Of course it is. We know that they try to avoid people retaking sections. They could have used just a few of those for certain test takers, and we just never heard from any of them, never encountered any of their reports. So if you had a double reading comprehension, I'd love to hear more about it. But at the same time, there weren't many of you, relatively speaking. And we know for a fact that even if you did have a double RC, if you had one of the two sections I just talked about, those were for sure real. So the reading comp was actually, I'd say, relatively easy. We just kept kind of compiling information about what we had already figured out, but it wasn't trying to parse out, is this real or experimental? We knew both of them were real, and that was the end of it.
Yeah, no comment. I agree. The only thing I've chuckled at a little bit there was the zebra mussels, because there was some confusion whether it was like the mollusk or the anatomy, fast twitch, slow twitch sort of thing. It was the mollusk.
Yeah, so maybe there's, some double RC people out there, and there might be somebody who's like, I was a double RC person. I was like, I didn't hear from you. And unfortunately, we didn't encounter anything from anyone else who was in that position. So I don't know yet if anybody like that existed. I guess we'll find out in the aftermath.
It would be the first time, at least to my knowledge, that they haven't used an entire section experimentally throughout the entire test administration. But again, I don't have any information. I know you don't either on reading comp experimental. So,
yeah, and I think when we get to the end of logical reasoning here, I'll maybe circle around to the idea of, because this was such a small test administration, as you pointed out earlier, there wasn't as much variation. There weren't that many scored forms of this exam, as it turns out. And so that's something that is kind of expected with a small test administration, and it has its both challenges and benefits. But Jon, let's go into logical reasoning, because we can start off on Friday with a section that we knew was real and we had a lot of information about.
Yeah, always a happy thing to be able to report about. I'll do the real stuff, and then I'll let you speculate. How's that sound?
Great, thanks.
You love it. So there was a real section of logical reasoning, and again, Friday kicked off with just about everyone, if not everyone, getting double games. So we knew right away any LR that we heard about was real. And it was a section we were able to match. This came right off of the November 2019 test from the experimental logical reasoning that we had seen there. November 19 was a released LSAT, but the experimental logical reasoning was still fair game, and they used it here. And this is what we saw. One of those sections, 26 questions. And I'll just run through some of the topics very quickly. If you recognize even one or two of these, that section counted for you. So there were questions about the obligation to be grateful, paying off a debt. One I heard a lot about was just an archer trying to maintain his or her reputation when facing death, when facing execution as a good archer. Fossilized leaves on different continents, Australia and 250 million years ago, ancient land masses moving around. Sleeping pills in a study where people slept better with placebos being told that they worked. It was a question I heard a lot of people talking about, the percentage of employees that are accountants versus the percentage of those accountants that happen to be at a conference. Classic, what sounds like numbers and percentages, trick, trap. Question about orcas and whales, and I think even dolphins, using echolocation to hunt, where they hunted fish with echolocation but not other mammals with it. And there was something about hunting at night or in the dark. A question I would love to see about fists evolving to punch, basically to be used for weapons, and how that led to the use of tools by humanoids. A couple of questions in this section about mayors, but one of the ones that came up a bunch was mayors not running for re-election, some partisanship issues, and a leadership skills committee or council. There's another question with mayors about garbage truck or city waste services, proposals or competitions, and the mayor's proposal about how to consolidate trash services. Question about Pluto and why we can't call Pluto a planet anymore. Memory in children's ages 3 to 7, how adults can't remember beyond or before a certain age and children between a gap could. A question I saw a lot come up over Saturday about pay for what you want, book selling, essentially, which sounds almost like an honor system kind of thing. Lifetime prison sentences was a question in this section. And finally, a question about city council funding and how it was going to be used for either parks or housing and how local residents felt about the distribution of those funds. All of those were part of a single section that counted. We saw it beginning Friday, and we saw it more or less constantly throughout the 2 testing days, including, I should say, a third day of accommodated yesterday. This was on the accommodated test for people paper and pencil yesterday.
And that not only is that known to be real, 26 questions, and as we'll see when we get down to the discussion of scale possibilities, a difficult section overall. So then on Saturday, one of the things we started to see was a second LR that popped in. So when we started to see that new single LG come in, a lot of people got that double LR set up, and they ended up with an experimental section. And here's the thing, that 26 question section was very tough, and it obviously has a lot of different questions to it that people were talking about. The pay what you want, pay as you go kind of thing kept coming up. And so it was really tough for us. This is where we were really challenged, I think, on Saturday to try to figure out what was experimental, what wasn't experimental, and to be able to separate it out. We think we've, at least identified several questions that were in a 25 question section, and that 25 question section was the experimental on this. So I'll cover a few of those and then, speculate on one or two more that I think might be in there. But again, this is not something that we feel rock solid about. I'm not staking our reputation on the hill here of the content of this section. And to be honest, we did not get a tremendous amount of information about it. And probably it's because it was part of LR, and LR is so tough for people to figure out because they're looking, when you have an experimental, you're looking at 50 plus questions in this case. That's really difficult to remember. Was it in this section or not? Some people had it back to back as sections 2 and 3, and it all runs together. So we certainly weren't mad about it. I was like, gosh, I'd love more information from somebody who has really clear recall, but that's just not the way it played out. I would love to hear more about it, and I'm sure we'll see it again in the future. But this 25 LR section that did not count had questions about things like jellyfish population. I think it had a question about loud noise with roosters and hens. A question about like human brow bones and how they've historically been thicker in early humans. I think there was a question there about like residential and commercial clients floating around. There's a couple other questions that we think were in this section. We're not entirely certain, but there was one about like West Nile birds and virus potency and light exposures, as well as like a sleep survey and a paradox there. So we think those were in that same exact section. So we know that that was experimental. Then on Tuesday, with the pencil and paper test takers, they were again given that 26 question that LR that we've already established was real. They were given another section that was experimental, and that had questions about like Shintoism and Buddhism on it. We think there was a question in there about Shakespeare and computer programming, showing that Shakespeare wrote part of the play, but not all of it. Someone else wrote the rest. A romantic period of music and people unfamiliar with a particular artist's work. So as far as we can tell, there was really only one scored LR throughout the weekend, and that was the one about the pay what you want for books and Pluto and orcas and mayors and accountants and so forth. That's pretty limited, but again, LR is the hardest to assess because of the many topics, and given the small size of the population of this test, it would make sense that they would aim right at that and be like, we only have to burn one real section. So they walked away from this test pretty happy.
Yeah, well, that makes one of them. You said before we weren't mad about it, and I just think speak for yourself. I would have loved to have heard more and gotten more information on this. LR always leaves me wanting, frankly. So
we always know that we're missing some topics, and it's not that this weekend is the problem. For me, it's next year, the year after, when I'm like, I wish I would have known that this section had a gold ring question on it, which I just made up. So I'm not saying that there was. Then someone later on is like, I had a question about a gold ring, and it's like, that's the connection that would have like sparked that. Because as I've said before, this is part science, but it's a little bit of magic and luck when we're putting this together to connect sections. And then thereafter, we try to use the pure science evaluation portion of it. But we got to find the sections in our database in order to know. And that can be harder than you think at times. So that's why
when
data
your
is so
database
important.
is thin in the present, you know that that's going to come back to basically haunt you in the future. And that's a little bit of what we're seeing here now, I think.
Yeah, if there was a test a couple of years ago where we didn't get a lot of information and they reuse parts of it now, well, then we're starting at a lower level than we would be with another test.
Yeah, we had the vast majority of the real LR questions because we had tracked the November 2019 test so closely, and we knew the experimental stuff from it. If we hadn't had that information back in November 2.5 years ago, we'd have been in a hard spot this time to match things up or to fill in gaps.
All right, so we're winding it down. So let's go to the scale predictions. And I can tell you that on Friday, I was like, we're not doing it. I had a hard line. I was like, I'm not doing it. I want to feel confident about scale predictions. We get challenged about them all the time. And I want to be able to say, no, there's a reason I thought this, and I can point to these factors as being persuasive. And on a Friday, especially with some of the uncertainty with logic games, it was a little bit uncertain. I've come around a little bit more now. And part of the reason for that is there just weren't that many scored sections. And so once again, we're going to focus on the sections that we've identified, feeling for sure that they are scored, and predict those. If your section isn't in here, then you were one of those people who just didn't have that, or we didn't hear about it. And as I've said, usually we don't say that that's the case or that's a possibility, but it definitely is a possibility. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about how the scoring scale matrix works. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on how many questions you can miss to get a 170. All right, the baseline where we start is 7. So if you see a reference to say -7 or -8 or -9, that means you can miss 7, 8, or 9 questions to get that 170 score. So that is our baseline. Then what we do from there is we look at each of the sections and we predict how the scale would move, if at all. So we might loosen it, we might tighten it, it might have no effect. So you might start off at -7 and then hear your logic games and say, okay, that loosened it. Then you might go to reading comprehension and say that had no effect, and so on. And so everybody is supposed to start at -7 and then connect the dots through the sections that they have. But this is solely to focus on 170. And then I'll let Jon talk about the predictions that we won't be making for some of the other scoring scale levels. But that's still to come here. This is a measure of top-line difficulty, and a lot of times top-line difficulty flows down a little bit throughout the rest of the scale. Not perfectly, but to some extent. So that's why we started this. This is also the easiest part of the test to predict because we can see top-line difficulty more clearly than we can say mid-level difficulty. There's a number of reasons for that. I'm not going to go into it. We've talked about it on other podcasts. Some of it's trade information that I don't want our friends out there in other companies to have either. So just keep that in mind. And the last thing I'll say is this. since apparently I'm the guy who has to read all the disclaimers like on a website before you agree to like have your information sent out.
You're that speed reader at the end of any prescription medication commercial.
I'm hating this role. Next time you're doing it.
Side effects may include.
No. We're generally conservative when we can be. When we have comfort on this, we try to be on the conservative side as opposed to the looser side of these scales because we want people to feel like, all right, that's the worst it could possibly be. So starting at -7, let's take a look at the logic games. The Friday section about the dance rehearsals, the orchestra instruments, the shelves, and the brands, okay? That section we feel was hard and would kind of loosen the scale by 1. So that would take those of you who had that scale from 7 to 8. By the way, if reassignments happen to be real, we think that would loosen it as well. So it almost doesn't matter which section was real, but we don't think reassignments ultimately was the real section here. We do think it was the shelves and the brands. So that would take you, if you were a person who had that test, from 7 to 8 to get a 170. You can miss 8 questions. The Saturday test takers who largely had the game about interviews, dance types, volunteer shifts, and then the north-south-west renovations, that section, unfortunately, does not move the needle for us as far as we could tell. We felt that was a medium difficulty section, and so if you had that, you'd stay at 7 questions missed to get a 170. Those were the only 2 scored LG that we have on the board. We didn't hear about anything else, so that's your 2 options right there. You're either loosening it by 1 or staying where you're at. So now take that position. Let's go to reading comprehension. The passage that appeared for a lot of Friday test takers was kind of like the Mary Prince, Thomas Pringle, the lawyer relations, the gene plasticity, and then kind of like the economist and bartering and credit. This was, as I said before, a very typical RC section for the modern era, which means it was hard. We think that loosens your scaling 1 more. So if you had that shelves and brands game, and then you had this RC, you've now moved from 7 to 9. And so that's tough. A lot of questions there to deal with. Gene plasticity, just, hearing those words makes me think, I don't want to read that. Jon probably thinks he wants to read it.
I feel like I wrote it.
Yeah, you feel like you wrote it. I was an econ major in college, so I'm like, give me that bartering and credit passage. I'll crush that. You handle the gene plasticity one. But this was a tough passage set, and we've already said that loosens it. The other section, the one that largely appeared on Saturday, about jazz, contract law, socialism, communism, technocrats, and zebra mussels, that is going to be no effect on the scaling. So again, depending on what you had, you're either loosening it by 1 or staying exactly the same here. And then
let me make a quick comment before you go to LR, because I know I can almost feel one of the potential criticisms at this point would be you guys are giving more weight in terms of difficulty to the things you heard more about, or the things that were probably distributed to more people or a greater percentage of people. And I thought a lot about that as we went through this scaling and assigned these numbers, and I'm confident that is not true. I think these are accurate assessments based on the difficulty objectively, as opposed to just how often we heard people talk about, oh God, that fashion brands, versus how, again, relatively less we heard about people talk about, hey, renovations. I do think that there was an actual difficulty difference in those sections. Ditto Darwin versus zebra mussels. There's a difficulty difference and discrepancy.
Yeah, and this isn't to say that a game about, say, renovations was easy.
Of course not.
We're not saying that it was easy. We know that it was at the end and it was tough. We're just saying that relative to the overall set of logic games in the last 5 to 8 years, as well as even the section that it's facing off against here, it wasn't as challenging. All logic game sections are difficult. So this is, again, relative. We just don't think it was difficult enough to move the scale in the 170s. Could it have moved the scales down in the 150s and the 160s? Of course.
Sure.
Yeah, we're not saying anything about that. We're focusing solely on the top line difficulty as the point of discussion. And so you can see there's some variation here, but I think we felt more and more comfortable as time went on in terms of what we're looking at and accumulated more information. Let's get to that LR section, of which there was only one that we identified, which means there's not that many variations of this test. Mm-hmm. It's really only 4 basic variations of this exam. And Jon will talk about that momentarily and kind of summarize for us. Mm-hmm. We can go into the past and find combinations where there's 40 or 50 different combinations. So if somebody's like, well, why did they do that? because there was hardly any test takers. It was only over 2 days. They didn't have to. So LR, this is the Orcas, the Pluto, the pay-as-you-go section. 26 questions. We think this was a very tough section, and this will for sure move the scale and loosen it by 1. There's, an argument that says that 26 questions, that kind of difficulty, maybe even a little bit more, shaded to 1.5, but we'll say 1 to keep it conservative, as I said before. So no matter what you had, your LG either kept it the same or loosened it by 1. Your RC either kept it the same or loosened it by 1. And for your LR, for all the sections that we've identified as real, that loosened it by 1.
Yeah. And if you only had a single LR and it wasn't the one with archers and orcas and fists and Pluto, then you'll have to make a determination on your own. Consider it relative to the things you have done recently. If it felt significantly harder, again, loosen your scale just as we have done with that section we described. If it felt in line, don't move it. If it felt comparatively easy, tighten it up on yourself. I know that's no fun, but it is realistic.
Yeah, and again, if that is the case, that's the reason we didn't talk about it, is because we didn't hear about it.
We didn't know.
Maybe you didn't say anything about it, and nobody gave us any reports. We didn't see anything online, and unfortunately, that's the way the cookie crumbled here.
We're only as good as what we know, which is usually quite a lot.
Yeah. You want the output of the scale prediction, we got to have the input of information. So,
That's right.
Jon, give us the summary, because with only really 4 outcomes, it's actually fairly easy to say this is what people had. And I think it's a surprising range, as I'm sure you'll cover.
It quite is, quite a range. And speaking of summaries, I think this is going to be maybe the most tempting moment for people to summarize and post. So I want to reiterate what Dave said before. Please don't do that. There is so much in this particular conversation, especially there's so much nuance and subtlety and degrees of shading to things that it would be a real shame, I think, if people thought it was as black and white as a summary might suggest. So despite the fact that I'm going to summarize, do as I say, not as I do.
No, listen to what you say.
Right.
Don't speak as you say.
Fair enough.
And we want to keep this free, and so this is the kind of thing where we're really hoping that people don't.
I don't think
summarize.
that's a very big ask.
Yeah,
we'll see. So, in terms of outcomes, in terms of what your 170 number of misses allowed could be, there's actually 4 potential places you could land here. For a -7 to get to a 170, this would be the combination of sections you would get. It would be the logic games with the dance types, polka and rumba, and the renovations. For reading comp, it would be the socialism, communism, and the zebra muscles. And then some other logical reasoning that we haven't mentioned that wouldn't move the needle. So you would stay at the starting point of where all of these matrices begin.
Yeah, so if we got it right and there was only one LR, this one doesn't exist.
You can ignore this.
Yeah, which most everybody listening is like, so I'm going to be looser than -7 for sure if I had the combination with that LR, and the answer is yes.
Yeah.
All right, so sorry to interrupt.
Perfect. No, that's a perfect interjection. If you recognize those LRs, you are a -8 or, frankly, better. Here's the -8. That's pretty straightforward. If you had logic games with dance types, renovations, that's not going to move it. If you had reading comp with socialism, zebra muscles, that's also not going to move it. But the LR that we just described, the archers, the orcas, etc., that will loosen it. So you go from a -7 to a -8, despite having the easier of the 2 games and reading comps.
Yep.
Yeah. Here's where things get a little squirmy at -9, because there are multiple ways that you could end up with a -9 scale for a 170. You could have that LR in the harder games, the easier reading comp, the LR and the harder reading comp in the easier games, the harder reading comp and the harder games in some different LR. Any of those combinations would put you at a -9.
I don't know that too many people had one of these -9 combinations, though. Just because of the way they presented the tests as almost like full-scale entities on Friday and then a totally kind of different entity alignment on Saturday. But it doesn't matter. It exists, at least in theory, so we've covered it. Get to the last one, because I think that some people will be fairly excited.
Yeah, despite all our hemming and hawing and hedging throughout this, there is maybe some gold at the end of this rainbow, which is that there is a -10 that I see as a very realistic scaling possibility, and it comes from this combination of content. With logic games, if you had that section with the shelves and the fashion brands, with reading comp, if you had the one about Thomas Prince and Mary Pringle, I think that's what it was, and Darwin, And with logical reasoning, if you had the Archer and the Pluto, that would actually loosen it section by section to a -10 scale, which I'm not sure we've ever comfortably arrived at before. We've suggested it's possible because we're conservative, but in this case, I think it's actually very realistic. This was a hard, hard test if those were the 3 scored sections that you saw.
Yeah, I don't recall us actually, arriving at -10 before. So when I realized what we'd had arrived at, because we do this in isolation, and then we kind of look at it afterwards and we're like, oh boy, look at that. That's a -10. And again, I will point this out. All this is relative. You might have taken an earlier LSAT and felt like that test was harder or this test was harder. Each individual experience has got so many facets to it that it will move around, it will change. Whether or not you drank coffee that day could affect how you felt about an individual test. So again, keep in mind that these are estimations based on a lot of information. In a perfect world, we'd have all the information that was available out there. That never happens. This time, as we've said repeatedly, it was a real challenge. But hopefully that gives everyone a sense of relative difficulty, even as they kind of go through these sections. Hopefully that confirms what a lot of people thought. I do think it's kind of weird that there's a test that was probably notably harder compared to the other section, the other common alignment, which was notably easier. It was really kind of more the case that the Friday test takers had what we felt was harder content. Now, they get a benefit. They get a looser scale. That is how difficulty works. If you have harder logical content on the test, the scale loosens up to offset that. On Saturday, what you had was what appears to us to be relatively easier logical content. And so the scale is tightened up a little bit, again, relatively speaking. So that's it doesn't often work that way, but because there were so few section alignments of scored information, there's just really not that many outcomes overall. It's a very weird test compared to what we normally see. And if you're like, well, what do you mean by that? Go back and listen to one of our recaps from, say, the fall, say August 2020 or somewhere in the summer, and think about how many sections we're talking about. 3 logical reasoning or 4 logical reasoning, 3 games, 3 reading comprehension, that kind of stuff. That's a lot of different possible combinations. We didn't have that here.
Yeah, there you go. To summarize a little bit of what you just said in terms of the discrepancy in days, I think it's entirely possible, if not probable, that the majority of people who took this on Friday had a scale that was 2 points different, looser, than the majority of people who tested on Saturday. And that is an extremely unusual situation, but I do think that's what's happened here.
Yeah, and last time we went through this and we made scale predictions at, say, 160, 155, and so forth, we're much more hesitant to do that this time. We don't feel as comfortable with like the mid-level information. Last time we felt really comfortable with it, and I felt good about those predictions. This time, I will say this and, keep on saying it. We won't make predictions unless we feel like we're comfortable with it and there's justification. And since we don't have that comfort, we're not going to, unfortunately, engage in kind of talking about those score levels because we think it's more speculative. We feel good about the 170 stuff that we said. We've given the caveats that we want to say. Going to the 165, 160, and so on seems like we're really just starting to guess, and that's not what we want to do.
I agree. So
there you go.
I think that more or less wraps it up. To circle back to one point that's relevant, probably to anyone listening to this, score release, again, Thursday, March 3rd at 9 a.m. Eastern. And if you're hanging around the internet about that time, the night before is when Dave and I will do our crystal ball. March 2nd at 8 p.m. Eastern. We will have a crystal ball for March and for April. And we plan on having it apply to both of those tests as of now. So join us for that and then wake up bright and early and hopefully see a score that means you don't have to take March or April.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go make another drink. You need to go out and have a good night on the town.
I need to try to find a power nap before this dude shows up.
Drink more of that Zero Ultra. All right. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. If you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com because we will be doing a mailbag episode sometime in the future. On Jon's behalf, for myself, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode and found the recap and predictions useful. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.